Sunday morning, April 2019. A 24-year-old woman named Sarah sits in her car outside First Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. The same church where her grandmother was baptized in 1952. The same sanctuary where her mother sang in the choir for 30 years. The same red brick building where Sarah herself attended vacation Bible school every summer until she was 14. Her phone buzzes, a text from her mother. "Are you coming in?" Sarah's fingers hover over the keyboard. She types and deletes 3 different responses before finally writing, "Not today, Mom. Maybe not ever again." She starts her car and drives away, past the packed parking lot, past the families streaming through the double doors in their Sunday best, away from a tradition that had defined her family for 4 generations. Sarah is not alone. She's part of a tidal wave that's reshaping the religious landscape of America so dramatically that demographers are calling it the most significant cultural shift in modern American history. Between 2009 and 2019, the percentage of Americans who never attend religious services jumped from 25% to 39%. But here's what makes this statistic truly staggering. In the 11 states that make up the traditional Bible Belt, from Texas to the Carolinas, the decline has been even steeper among those under 40. In 2023, for the first time in recorded American history, the majority of adults under 35 in Mississippi, the most religious state in the nation, reported attending church less than once a month. Mississippi. Let that sink in. The state where there are more churches per capita than gas stations, where high school football games still open with prayer, where "what church do you attend?" remains a standard getting to know you question. Even Mississippi is losing its young people to what researchers are now calling the Great Unmosaic. The Bible Belt wasn't always the Bible Belt. The term was actually coined in 1924 by journalist H. L. Mencken, and it was meant as an insult, describing what he saw as the backwards, fundamentalist regions of the American South. But by the mid-20th century, that insult had been reclaimed with pride. By 1972, church attendance in southern states averaged 67% compared to just 42% in the Northeast. The church wasn't just where you worshiped, it was your social network, your resume reference, your dating pool, your community safety net, and often your political identity. In towns across Arkansas, Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama, the question wasn't whether you went to church, it was which church you attended, and that answer said everything about you. But something broke. Or perhaps more accurately, something shifted so fundamentally that the entire foundation cracked. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we excavate the stories that reshape our understanding of who we are and where we're headed. If you find yourself learning something new here today, if this investigation into American culture resonates with you, consider hitting that super thanks button. It keeps these deep dives possible and helps us continue exploring the threads that connect our past to our present. The numbers tell part of the story, but numbers alone can't capture the human dimension of what's happening. Let's look at what the data actually shows us. In 1990, 89% of Americans under 30 identified as religiously unaffiliated. By 2021, that number had exploded to 56%. Among Gen Z specifically, those born between 1997 and 2012, a stunning 34% identify as atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. But here's where it gets interesting. This isn't evenly distributed across the country. The Bible Belt states are experiencing something like a religious recession, while coastal states are merely continuing existing trends. Why? Because there was further to fall. Take a congregation in Knoxville, Tennessee. Union Avenue Baptist Church, founded in 1886, once boasted a membership of 3,200 people. Their Sunday school program was so large they had to run multiple sessions. Kids who grew up there in the 1980s remember waiting in lines for the church carnival, participating in youth groups with 70 teenagers, attending summer camps where hundreds of children from across the South would gather. In 2022, Union Avenue Baptist Church held its final service. 47 people attended. The average age was 68. The building was sold to a developer who converted it into luxury apartments. In the sanctuary where thousands once sang hymns, young professionals now do yoga. This pattern is repeating across the region. Between 2015 and 2023, more than 4,500 churches closed in the Bible Belt states alone. But it's not just about closures, it's about transformation. The children who once filled those pews, they're still there geographically. Many millennials and Gen Z members never left their hometowns. They simply stopped going to church. A 2022 study by the Public Religion Research Institute found that in Alabama, 44% of residents aged 18 to 29 had attended church regularly as children, but now attend less than twice a year. They're still in Alabama. They're just not in the pews. So what happened? What could possibly fracture a religious culture so deeply embedded that it defined regional identity? Here's where the story gets complicated because there's no single answer. There's a constellation of causes, each amplifying the others in ways that even the experts didn't predict. Let's start with what researchers call the Internet revelation. Marcus, a 31-year-old from rural Georgia, described it this way in an interview with the Pew Research Center. I was homeschooled in a very conservative Christian environment. I was taught that the Bible was inerrant, that evolution was a lie, that homosexuality was an abomination. Then I got internet access at 16. Within 6 months, my entire worldview had been challenged in ways I couldn't ignore. I found out that the flood geology we'd been taught wasn't accepted by any actual geologists. I discovered that biblical scholars, even Christian ones, didn't believe Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. I connected with gay people my age who seemed more Christ-like in their behavior than many of the Christians I knew. The internet didn't make me question God, it made me question what I'd been told about God. And once those questions started, they didn't stop. Marcus's story is not unique. It's the story of a generation that grew up with the entire sum of human knowledge accessible through a device in their pocket. For the first time in American history, the religious authorities in small towns couldn't control the information ecosystem. A teenager in Mississippi could join online communities of atheists, agnostics, progressive Christians, or people from entirely different faith traditions. They could fact-check sermons in real time. They could discover that the Creation Museum they'd been taken to as children was scientifically rejected by 97th percentile of working biologists. Information asymmetry, which had long protected certain religious narratives from scrutiny, collapsed almost overnight. But information alone doesn't explain the exodus. After all, challenging questions about faith have existed for centuries. Thomas Paine was writing scathing critiques of Christianity in the 1790s. What made this different? The answer might lie in the intersection of politics and religion that intensified in the late 20th century and reached a fever pitch in the 2010s. The fusion of evangelical Christianity with conservative Republican politics had been building since the 1970s. But by the time millennials reached adulthood, the two had become nearly indistinguishable in many Bible Belt churches. Jessica, a 28-year-old from Oklahoma who requested her last name not be used, recalled, I remember the exact moment I started pulling away. I was 19, sitting in church the Sunday after the 2012 election. Our pastor spent 45 minutes ranting about how Obama's re-election was a sign of moral decay, and how any Christian who voted for him wasn't a real Christian. My mom, who worked 2 jobs to keep us fed, had voted for Obama because she thought the Affordable Care Act might help us afford health care. According to our pastor, she wasn't a real Christian. I looked around at all these people nodding along, and I realized that for many of them, Republican politics and Christianity had merged into one thing. That was the beginning of the end for me. The data backs up Jessica's experience. A 2017 study found that among millennials who left the church, 63% cited the church's involvement in politics as a major factor. But this wasn't just about partisanship, it was about authenticity. Many young people reported feeling that the church had become more concerned with political power than with the actual teachings of Jesus. The cognitive dissonance between love your neighbor and political rhetoric that seemed harsh toward immigrants, the poor, and LGBTQ individuals became impossible to reconcile. I'm curious, where are you watching this from right now? Are you in the Bible Belt yourself? Watching this at midnight when your parents are asleep? Are you in California, trying to understand family members back home? Drop a comment and let us know what profession you have and whether you've witnessed this shift firsthand. Then there's the sexual revolution that finally reached conservative America, albeit decades late. For generations, evangelical purity culture had taught that sexual expression outside of heterosexual marriage was not just wrong, but the primary moral failing of young people. Entire youth group curricula focused on abstinence. Books like I Kissed Dating Goodbye sold millions of copies in the 1990s and early 2000s. Young people, especially young women, were taught that their primary value lay in their sexual purity, that they were like chewed gum or used tape if they had sex before marriage, worthless and undesirable. But by the 2010s, this message was crashing against reality. Studies showed that 80% of unmarried evangelical young adults between 18 and 29 were sexually active, the same rate as their non-religious peers. The purity culture messaging hadn't changed behavior. It had only added shame, guilt, and often trauma. When young people who had been taught that premarital sex was the ultimate sin engaged in it anyway, many felt they had already crossed the uncrossable line. Why continue attending a church that made them feel condemned for being human? And then there was the LGBTQ question. In 1990, only 13% of Americans supported same-sex marriage. By 2021, that number was 70%. Among those under 35, support was even higher at 84%. But most Bible Belt churches maintained firm opposition to LGBTQ inclusion. The result was predictable. Young people who had gay classmates, friends, siblings, or who were LGBTQ themselves faced an impossible choice. Choose the church or choose the people they loved. Increasingly, they chose people over institution. Rachel, a 26-year-old from South Carolina, explained it this way. My best friend came out as gay when we were 16. I watched him struggle, attempt suicide, go through conversion therapy that traumatized him. The church told me I needed to love him by telling him he was sinful and needed to change. But I had read the Gospels. I knew what love looked like, and it didn't look like that. I realized I had to choose between what the church said Jesus taught and what Jesus actually taught. I chose Jesus, and that meant leaving the church. The stories of individuals like Rachel reveal something crucial. Many millennials and Gen Z members who left the church don't see themselves as leaving faith. They see themselves as trying to preserve it from institutions that corrupted it. But there's another factor that gets less attention: economic precarity. The traditional American life script went something like this: graduate high school or college, get a stable job, get married, buy a house, have kids, all while still fairly young. The church provided the framework for this life script, especially marriage and family formation. But for millennials, this script became impossible to follow. They graduated into the Great Recession. They faced stagnant wages despite increasing productivity. The median home price increased $101% between 2000 and 2023, while median wages increased only 43%. Millennials delayed marriage, many indefinitely. They couldn't afford children. They moved frequently for work, severing community ties. The church was designed for a stable, rooted, family-oriented life. When that life became unattainable, the church's relevance diminished. A single 29-year-old working gig economy jobs and living with 3 roommates doesn't have the same need for church-based community that a married 29-year-old with 2 kids and a house in the suburbs does. The church social structure was built for the latter, and when economic forces made that lifestyle increasingly rare, the church struggled to adapt. And the churches that did try to adapt often faced fierce resistance from older congregants. Reverend Michael Thompson, a 42-year-old pastor from Arkansas who left ministry in 2021, told researchers, I tried everything. I suggested bringing in contemporary music, updating our stance on LGBTQ inclusion to be more welcoming, focusing less on culture war politics and more on service. Every single suggestion was voted down by the deacon board, average age 73. They wanted the young people back, but only if the young people would accept the church exactly as it was. They couldn't understand that the world had changed. This intergenerational conflict became a death spiral. Young people left because the church wouldn't change. The people remaining were disproportionately older and more conservative. This made the church even less likely to change, which drove away even more young people. The human cost of this shift is often overlooked in the statistics. For many Bible Belt families, religion was the glue that held everything together. Sunday dinners, holiday traditions, shared values, common language, all rooted in church participation. When young people left the church, they weren't just changing their Sunday morning plans, they were often fracturing family relationships. Tom, a 68-year-old from Tennessee, described the pain this way. My 3 children all grew up in the church. Now none of them attend. My grandchildren have never been baptized. We used to have this shared understanding of the world, this common framework for discussing morality, purpose, meaning. Now when we talk, it's like we're speaking different languages. I don't know how to connect with them anymore. They think I'm a judgmental fundamentalist. I think they've lost their way. Every family gathering is awkward. We avoid talking about anything meaningful because it always leads to conflict. The fracturing is real, and it's happening in millions of families across the Bible Belt. A 2023 study found that 80% of Bible Belt parents over age 60 have adult children who no longer identify with the family's religion. And 71% of those parents report that this has caused moderate to severe family tension. But here's a twist in the narrative. Not all leaving is the same. Researchers have identified at least 4 distinct categories of religious disaffiliation among Millennials and Gen Z, and understanding these categories helps explain why this shift has been so comprehensive. First, there are the nones with baggage. These are individuals who left the church but carry significant religious trauma. They report nightmares about hell. They feel guilt about normal human behaviors that were condemned in their religious upbringing. They often describe their departure not as liberation but as painful necessity. They wanted to stay, they tried to believe, but the cognitive dissonance became unbearable. Second, there are the comfortable nones. These individuals left the church and report relief more than pain. Often they were never particularly devout, went to church primarily because of family or community pressure, and once they gained independence, simply stopped attending. They describe feeling like they'd been released from an obligation that never made sense to them. Third, there are the spiritual but not religious. This group, which makes up about 40% of young religious disaffiliates, still believe in God or some higher power but reject organized religion. They might meditate, practice yoga, explore Buddhism or paganism, or create their own syncretic spiritual practices. They see institutional religion as corrupt or limiting, but still seek transcendence and meaning. Finally, there are the hard atheists. This smaller but vocal group not only left religion but actively oppose it. They view religion as harmful to society and often engage in anti-religious activism. Interestingly, this group is smaller than commonly assumed, making up only about 15% of young people who left the church. Understanding these categories matters because they require different responses. The trauma-carrying nones need therapeutic resources and communities that take their harm seriously. The comfortable nones were likely never going to remain church members regardless of church policies. The spiritual seekers might be drawn to progressive faith communities that emphasize mystery and inclusion over certainty and exclusion. The hard atheists have likely made a decision that no church accommodation will reverse. Many churches, however, treat all departing members the same, either defensively insisting the problem is with the individual's faith rather than the institution, or desperately trying to make cosmetic changes that address none of the underlying issues. And those underlying issues are profound. Let's talk about the theological crisis at the heart of this exodus. For many young people, the problem isn't that they stopped believing in God, it's that the God they were taught to believe in became morally unacceptable to them. Consider hell. Traditional evangelical doctrine teaches that anyone who doesn't accept Jesus as their personal savior will be tortured for eternity after death. Not just bad people. All people who don't have the correct belief, including good people who happen to be born in non-Christian countries, or children who died before hearing the gospel, or people who heard the gospel but found it unpersuasive. For a young person with Hindu friends, atheist classmates they respected, or beloved family members who didn't share their faith. The idea that these people deserved infinite torture for finite crimes or honest disbelief became increasingly monstrous. Bethany, a 32-year-old from Mississippi, described her breaking point. I was taught that my grandfather, who was the kindest man I ever knew but who was Jewish and never converted, was burning in hell. I was supposed to believe that a God of love would torture my grandfather for eternity because he didn't accept Jesus. I was supposed to worship that God. I couldn't do it. Either the doctrine was wrong or God was a monster. I chose to believe the doctrine was wrong. This theological reckoning is happening across the Bible Belt. Young people are asking questions that previous generations were taught never to ask. If God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good, why is there so much suffering? If the Bible is the inerrant word of God, why does it contain contradictions, scientific errors, and moral commands like genocide that we now recognize as evil? If Christianity is the one true religion, why does geography determine religious belief more than anything else? If you had been born in Saudi Arabia, you'd almost certainly be Muslim. Does that mean your Christianity is more about birthplace than truth? These questions aren't new. Philosophers and theologians have grappled with them for millennia. But for the first time, average young people in the Bible Belt have access to those philosophical debates, and many find the traditional answers unsatisfying. The institutional response to this crisis has been mixed. Some churches have moved toward progressive theology, embracing biblical scholarship, accepting evolution, affirming LGBTQ inclusion, and preaching a God of love over a God of judgment. These churches have seen some success in retaining and attracting young members, but they face accusations of heresy from conservative churches and often struggle to articulate why one should attend church at all if the traditional doctrines are abandoned. Other churches have doubled down on conservative theology, viewing the Exodus as a purification process separating true believers from false ones. These churches often thrive in the short term among true believers, but continue losing young members at high rates. There's also a fascinating gender dimension to this story. Women have historically been more religious than men across almost all cultures. But among millennials and Gen Z, that gap is closing. Young women are leaving the church at higher rates than any previous generation of women. Why? Many point to issues of gender equality and bodily autonomy. Churches that preach complementarianism, the doctrine that men and women have different but complementary roles with men in leadership, are increasingly out of step with young women who have been educated in the same classrooms as men, who work in the same jobs, who have been told their entire lives that they can be anything, and who then attend churches that tell them they cannot be pastors or elders because of their gender. And then there's abortion. The overturning of Roe v. Wade in 2022 was celebrated by many evangelical leaders as a great victory, but polling data suggested accelerated religious disaffiliation among young women. A 2023 study found that among women aged 18 to 34 who had attended evangelical churches but stopped, 58% cited the church's stance on reproductive rights as a significant factor in their departure. They watched churches celebrate the removal of reproductive autonomy, and they left. Let's zoom out for a moment and consider what all this means for American society. The Bible Belt was never just a demographic reality. It was a cultural and political force. It provided a base of reliable voters for conservative politicians. It shaped social norms around family, sexuality, community, and morality in much of the South and Midwest. It funded missionary work globally. It operated thousands of schools, hospitals, and charities. As the Bible Belt weakens, all of this changes. Political analysts have already noted that states like Georgia, Arizona, and even Texas are becoming more competitive politically, partly because young voters in those states are less reliably conservative than their parents, and religion was a key predictor of conservative voting. If current trends continue, the electoral map of America may be fundamentally redrawn within the next decade. There are also economic consequences. Churches are tax exempt and receive billions in donations annually. That money employs people, maintains buildings, and funds various services. As churches close, that economic activity disappears. Rural towns that lost manufacturing jobs in the 1990s and retail jobs in the 2010s are now losing church jobs in the 2020s. The megachurch that employed 30 people and drew thousands to the area on Sundays becomes luxury apartments or sits vacant. Community services are also affected. Churches historically provided social safety nets, disaster relief, food banks, addiction recovery programs, and counseling services. As churches weaken, who fills that gap? In many cases, no one does. Government services haven't expanded to compensate for declining church capacity, creating genuine voids in communities that are already struggling. But it would be wrong to paint this solely as a story of loss. Many young people who left the church report improved mental health, greater authenticity in their relationships, freedom to explore their identities without shame, and relief from the anxiety that came with trying to believe things they found unbelievable. They formed new communities around shared interests rather than shared doctrine. They found meaning in social justice work, environmental activism, art, science, philosophy, and human connection. There's also a growing movement of progressive faith communities trying to offer spirituality without the baggage of traditional evangelical theology. Churches that affirm LGBTQ members, that embrace science, that focus on social justice, that allow doubt and questioning, that present God as love rather than judge, these communities remain small but are growing, suggesting that perhaps it's not religion itself that young people are rejecting, but a particular expression of it. So where does this all lead? Demographic trends suggest that within 15 years, the Bible Belt as a distinct religious region may cease to exist. Church attendance rates in southern states will be statistically indistinguishable from the national average. The churches that remain will be smaller, older, and more conservative. Or they'll be progressive outliers serving a small but devoted community. The cultural implications are staggering. The South has been defined by its religious character for so long that many wonder what Southern identity becomes when that religious foundation crumbles. What holds communities together when Sunday morning is no longer the gathering time? How do families navigate relationships when grandparents and grandchildren have entirely different worldviews? How does politics realign when religious identity no longer predicts voting behavior? These are not just academic questions. They're being lived out in real time in millions of homes, on Sunday mornings when parents sit in pews that their children will never occupy, at Thanksgiving dinners where religion has become the topic everyone avoids, in small towns where church buildings are being converted to breweries and event spaces. The generational divide over religion in the Bible Belt is perhaps the clearest example of a broader truth. We are living through a period of cultural transformation as significant as the 1960s, but it's happening more quietly. It's not characterized by mass protests or dramatic confrontations, but by individual decisions, by young people quietly walking away, by families growing apart, by communities slowly dying and new ones being born. The old faith, the faith of Billy Graham revivals and tent meetings, of altar calls and Sunday school, of absolute certainty and cultural dominance, that faith is breaking apart in the hands of millennials and Gen Z. What emerges from those shattered pieces remains to be seen. Maybe nothing. Maybe something entirely new. Maybe many small somethings, fragmented and diverse, reflecting a generation that values authenticity over tradition, questions over answers, inclusion over exclusion.